The recent successes of Russian economy are due to better financial discipline, constitution of strong financial reserve. They helped due to political consolidation under the leadership of Putin, who supported several measures in the fiscal sphere. I should tell you that it was quite uneasy to maintain very restrained and conservative policy related to high oil prices and creation of stabilization and reserve fund and national Commonwealth Fund, the systems of goal-oriented budgeting and targeted policies that provoked several criticisms. Many believe that we are creating reserves instead of establishing major industrial enterprises that would liberate the country from its dependency from oil. And due to the support of the leadership of the country, we managed to maintain this restricted and restrained economic policy. But I think that in terms of fiscal and monetary policy, it was too mild. I think that we need to have a more tough fiscal policy. Over the recent years, the growth of money offer, money supply grew to 50 or 60%, which is too much, I think. This means that we conducted a too mild fiscal policy. And the growth of loans to real sector in 2007 amounted to 50% over 1 year. And in 2008, when we felt first indications of crisis, the amount was 35%. And I cannot say that all those loans were good or unproblematic. We have difficulties to assess risks related to cyclical nature of economy, and especially in connection with the so acute crisis that we face today. Even if we lacked the experience in the management of the banks in producing quality loans, we still had some difficulties. But it is not enough to have experienced management in the banks. Of course, we sense the risks and additional risks related with Russian specifics that we have today in Russia. But nevertheless, it is not easier for government and for the Ministry of Finance to act accordingly, despite the presence of major reserves. Russia's dependency on export of oil and gas and export of metals and other raw materials was too big, and today it creates additional shrinking of demand inside Russia. In this sense, we are observing the curtailment and shrinking of the sectors that ensured demand, supply and demand directly, domestically in Russia. Judging the outcomes of the first quarter, they were worse than we expected. We thought that the drop of GDP in the first quarter would 7.5%. Now it turned out to be 9.5%. We thought that the industry would drop 10.5%. It dropped 14.3%. Investments decreased 15%, and the biggest decrease is observed in the processing industry, which is equal to 22.8%, and in construction and building 19.3%. Unemployment is growing, and that calls on us to reconsider our assessments and forecasts for the prospects by the end of the year. We are going to publish a new forecast next week, But I must tell you that the forecasts of the IMF are close to the assessments made by our analysts. We are dependent to a great degree on the world economy. The first glimpse of hope to the positive growth in the United States and in the world have emerged. There are first feelings that the situation would improve. I would like very much to hope that for that the measures adopted by the American state also have an impact on what is happening in the world and in the developing markets, including Russia. However, there are some alarming, worrying indicators that tell us that the crisis can protract. For instance, the non-use of full capacity of industrial potential, so the shrinkage is only starting even in the United States, and perhaps it will continue, and perhaps we will feel the impact of that factor. The reserves, the stocks started to decline. The financial sector is not enough stable, and no substantial improvement can be stated, despite some income indicators we saw in the recent future. I must tell you that those indicators are quite unstable and volatile. We will need to take this into account in our policy. Today it is obvious that we must calculate our forces and capacity for a longer period, longer than 1 or 2 years, and to look for a slow upturn and coming out of crisis. In Russia, we are planning our measures based on the assumption that we will be on the guard on long-term siege of negative factors. So we intend to keep strong reserves at 7.5% despite the deficit of the budget. Nevertheless, perhaps our economy will call for a bigger deficit so as not to reconsider major programs that the government has announced. Next year, in 2010-2011, we are going to decrease this deficit, and we announced preliminary figures of 5% of deficit in 2010 and 3% in 2011. This is rather a strenuous task, but we are going to keep to this promise to preserve macroeconomic stability so as not to deplete our resources rapidly. Unlike in the West, we face also the risk of inflation, which has to do with the recent devaluation of ruble to dollar, almost 50% to dollar, and somewhat less, 40% in the basket of currencies. So this devaluation affects the imports, and the last years of economic growth we increased our imports. So depending on the impact of imports, we will have the negative results in terms of price surge. Now the inflation is slowing down, and we expect that the indicators for the year of 13% will be preserved. However, the high budget deficit that will be financed through the reserves and not through the borrowing at the open market will produce another inflationary risk. And this is the reason why we are going to preserve moderate deficit. I mentioned the deficit of 7.5%. Together with subordinated loans to the banks, altogether it will amount to 8%, according to international rules. Perhaps it will be somewhat higher due to another risks. The first measures we took in the combat against markets were measures to maintain financial stability. In last October, when we understood that perhaps we would face the prospect of devaluation and the first indicators of crisis appeared, the confidence to banks decreased considerably, and people remembering their experience of '98 made a rush run on the banks, withdrawing their accounts up to $15 billion over the last time. For some banks, it was more than 10% of deposits and accumulated assets. Russia issued subordinated loans to the banks for the amount of $40 billion that helped save the banking system and maintain its stability. Moreover, those subordinated loans were allocated or earmarked from the National Commonwealth Foundation and from the budget. Moreover, we offered greater liquidity at the market, which supported the banks but contributed to the outflux of capitals. The central bank opted for a strategy of smooth devaluation that was highly debated, but again we took into account two considerations. First, the concerns of population about the shock devaluation that could produce the rush run effect, and second, the big amounts of external foreign debt of corporate clients. This would create the risk of non-payment and non-return of credits for major enterprises. In a situation of smooth decline, the banks restructured their portfolio, and if in October foreign liabilities surpassed the foreign assets, in February they reconstituted 100 liabilities of the banks, restructured in such a way as to be combined with 100% of foreign assets. The banks accumulated or repaid a part of their foreign debts, or accumulated some reserves in foreign exchange so as to repay their debts or to protect themselves from the currency exchange risks. Those measures turned out to be quite expensive, but they helped to maintain the stability and permitted us to continue this work. So the situation is quite satisfactory at the initial stage, especially as far as it concerns financial sector. And the second set of measures we used was the measures to reduce taxes. We reduced income tax from 24 to 20% and increased amortization premium for upgrading and modernization from 20 to 30%. In other words, 30% of equipment supplied this year will be equal to 30% reduction of taxable basis. This was a stimulus for re-equipment of industrial enterprises, especially for those who worked at the high stage of modernization through the received loans. Let me ponder on a package of measures adopted this week. This is a major program to support small businesses. We reduced the taxes on enterprises. We expanded the list of small enterprises almost twice as much, and so we provided fiscal facilities for such enterprises by reducing twofold their taxes. We increased several $billion the guarantees to lending facilities, allocated additional resources to support regional small business foundations, adopted a package of legislation limiting the inspections by law enforcement and fiscal agencies during the following years, especially this year. So a set of measures to support small business were adopted.
The total volume of reduction of taxes reaches approximately 1.5–2% of the GDP. That is the part of the entire crisis package that is related to the easing of the taxation burden. Another part of this package is related to the support of the pension system, since the proceedings in the pension system decreased due to the crisis and due to the decrease of the wages as well. So we adopted a number of measures to support individual industries such as car manufacturing industry, aircraft manufacturing industry, shipbuilding, and some others. And we also support the export industries. We provided additional guarantees to stimulate the exports from Russia. If I add it all up, then totally the fiscal package that is provided additionally to the initial budget amounts approximately 6% of the GDP. Quite often in Russia they mention the figure 10–12% of the GDP, but that's not quite accurate, because that is the envisaged volume of liquidity that was provided by the central bank and the government on a temporary basis to the market. But I should say that the volume of the fiscal package in Russia, including taxes, amounts approximately 6%. That would be a more accurate figure. We believe that this is an adequate package. Its increase now could have resulted in greater risks in the area of inflation, capital flight, and quick depletion of reserves. So we believe that the chosen strategy is well balanced, and it will help us to maintain the sustainability of the Russian economy, of the financial system for this year and the years to come. Indeed, we have a serious challenge in front of us as regards the optimization of the state spendings. It covers all areas such as roads, culture, education, defense. Now we're preparing a new program for the coming 3 years, starting from 2010 to last until 2012, and these programs will provide some priorities for this government. This is related to the point that this year, in 2009, the budgetary revenues decreased by 30% compared to 2008. That is a high degree of crisis influence on the budget. This is related mainly with oil and gas and the quick shrink of the GDP. And this shows that Russia is more vulnerable than other countries as regards its structure of exports, the structure of its own economy, and of course this creates greater need to promote diversification in the coming years. Therefore, the tasks will be restructured to stimulate innovations, transfer to the saving technologies. We are preparing a major program on energy efficiency and economical use of energy resources. Will provide additional program to reform the housing and utilities sectors to make it more efficient, and I should say that the expenditures for the state management are cut by 12%. I repeat that these are the programs to optimize our life, and they will be implemented in many different areas. Speaking about the new program for sanation of banking system, the main challenge is bad loans here and the increasing volume of non-performing loans or non-returnable loans. In accordance with Russian standards, these non-performing loans account for 3% in the Russian system. But the Russian standards are different from international standards, and there the non-performing loan is the whole amount of a loan that see non-payments. So approximately that means 7.5–8% of problematic loans, bad loans, the loans that have some problems in terms of servicing in accordance with international standards. 10% for us is a kind of a threshold, and then we will need to provide some additional support to the banking sector. Therefore, this week, 2 days ago, the government announced a new program to support the banks. Additionally, $28 billion in the form of subordinated credits. This includes the support to Bank and Sberbank on the part of the state as the main shareholder, and co-financing of subordinated credits together with the shareholders in private banks. We will offer, in the form of subordinated credits, 3 rubles by the state versus 1 ruble from the private shareholders. That is the second stage of the subordinated credits program, which in total, if we take state-owned bank and private banks, is worth $28 billion. I think that 10% may be not the last boundary, the last threshold of bad loans that we will have in the environment of such a deep crisis. That can be more, and the resources of the government, the state, allow us to provide additional support should the risks get higher. Of course, I want to say a few words about our international relations. I write here from the meeting with the trade representative of the United States, and we discussed the issues of trade and Russia's accession to the World Trade Organization, and also had a meeting with the new Commerce Secretary of the U.S. But I should say that the WTO is just a part of the problem in our bilateral relations. The agenda is much longer, of course, and it includes the problem of disarmament in the nuclear weapons in the first place. Then it includes the ABM issues, also the cooperation with NATO issues, economic cooperation, investment regimes of our nations, the U.S. investments to Russian investments in the U.S., support of the trade. We're still not the members of the WTO, and therefore trade relations affect various sensitive areas. Education and culture is also on the agenda, and these matters were included in my discussions during my meetings in the State Department this morning. In general, I should say that I participated in the meeting of our Presidents Medvedev and Obama in London, and I must say that the restart process is underway, and today after the meeting it is acquiring very specific features. We expect that The President of the United States, Mr. Obama, will visit Russia in July, and we are preparing some decisions that can be adopted at that summit. And I think that it is a very short period of time, and I think that we must do our best to support with specific solutions and decisions this mood of good relations between our presidents. We expect that our relations will improve in many areas, and I believe that the coming months are going to be very important in order to implement these expectations that we have in our relations. Naturally, after the London summit, the role of the emerging markets is growing as regards the world regulation. A serious program was developed to improve the regulation for the world financial markets. You know what the discussion was like between the European representatives and the US and the UK at the G20 summit in London. I think that it was not an empty discussion. There are objective differences in approaches towards the ways out of the crisis, and on how to maintain the financial discipline and how to regulate the market. Such countries as Russia, China, and we have a new format for our work that is 4 countries, BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. We're meeting regularly in this format. We had the last meeting in London, and after this speech I'm heading to the BRIC ministers meeting here. And among us, we discussed the role of our countries as regards the elaboration of these new rules, world rules. We discussed the involvement of our countries into the elaboration of measures to combat the crisis, the provision of additional resources. So the questions that were raised not only during this crisis but before the crisis, where the IMF is the real representative of all groups of countries, stronger countries like the emerging markets, does the IMF do the IMF decisions take account of the interests of all countries? But I think the IMF, the World Bank, and other financial institutions, they should increase the role of the developing and emerging markets with the due reflection of their capacity and role. Therefore, we note with satisfaction the process of inclusion of our countries into the Financial Stability Forum, which is called the Financial Stability Board now, the Basel Committee, and I think that this process was launched and by the next year, and I'm in the World Bank, and by 2011 in the IMF, we'll see more decisive changes in quotas and representation of our economies in these institutions. Accordingly, we would like to see that the responsibility is growing on the world markets, not only with the developing nations, but that of the developed nation is growing too. For Russia and China, it is still important what is the prospects of the US dollar zone from the viewpoint of investment of our resources to be preserved on this market. We would like to know the prospects of the euro area, and we must be sure about these prospects. Therefore, both the United States and the European Union, as the institutions, should bear responsibility for their fundamental indicators. Probably this is also the matter of international regulation, and that is what we were discussing at our meetings. Whether this regulation is going to be voluntary, soft, mild, whether it is going to regulate only financial markets and instruments, but the macroeconomies too. And we'll also discuss the extent to which the developed nations will bear responsibility over their macroeconomic fundamentals, whether it's going to be discussed and regulated, and what responsibility. This probably requires additional discussions and debates in order to work out new rules, and therefore I think that the meetings that we had in London and that we will have today and tomorrow here in Washington DC is related to the creation of the new world's financial architecture that will be very different from the financial architecture we have had until present, and Russia will get involved into these processes. I think I probably didn't cover all of the questions that were of interest to you, and therefore in my answers I'll be very happy to answer your questions. Thank you very much.
Mr. Minister, thank you very much for covering indeed a very wide range of topics and opening up a number for discussion with the audience. We'll open it up to the group for questions, but I'd like to ask George Soros if he would like to lead off. George.
I very much regret I didn't actually hear your remarks because I was at the IMF, but I'm very, very happy to hear at the very end that Russia is going to play a constructive role in reconstructing the international financial system, that Russia is intending to maintain an open economy. And I also want to welcome some of the practical signs that I see that I find very encouraging. The fact that I think just a day or two ago, President Medvedev met with civil society and had a meeting that was supposed to last an hour and a half, spent 4 hours discussing how civil society and non-governmental organizations could function more freely in Russia. I think that the fact that a lawyer who was sentenced to jail, Ms. Vakmina, who was defending Khodorkovsky, has been released. In that context, I hope that the trial will be a fair one, because it's very important for the rule of law to be more properly observed in Russia. And I think we should respond to these signs from Russia in a very constructive way when it comes to restructuring debts and generally enabling Russia to cope with its own financial crisis. I think we are talking about sort of resetting the reset button, and I think that it's now perhaps taking a practical form, and I think that is greatly to be welcomed. And finally, I can't help but acknowledge our personal cooperation, because we are both supporters of the European Humanities University and Smolny Institute, and you've helped to raise funds for it. These are private institutions, so it's really a pleasure to be hearing you here. Thank you.
Но если я почувствовал, то не было вопроса.
Well, as far as I sensed, there was no question, but it was rather a comment. Let me only emphasize what you stated at the end about the support of private institutions, education institutions. I'm acting as a trusteeship board in some of those institutes, and I hope that this support will help some major institutes in Russia to stand strongly on their feet. And the more such institutes we have, the better, since the establishment of high-quality education in Russia is a priority both for the public and the government, and those priorities will come through only if we have more private institutions with a good financial basis. Thank you very much. much for your comment, but I'm prepared to take all your questions as well.
Okay, I'll go to Jim Wolfenson to put a real question to you. Jim.
I have the benefit that George did not have of having listened to you, Mr. Minister. And I do want to thank you for really an embracing talk on the Russian economy, and in particular in describing your role at the center of the financial community, of which all of us, I think, are very much aware. I'd like to direct you to one of your early observations, or early remarks about unemployment in your country, and take you to the issue of poverty, not surprisingly. Over the years, you've done a terrific job in bringing people out of poverty in your country. And the most recent statistics would indicate that there is some reversal of this excellent record. I'd like to get your impressions on what it is that the government can do in relation to such things as pensions, as child benefits, as unemployment, at a time when you're trying to keep your budget deficit, as you said, down to 5%. What are you going to do in terms of priorities, matching the social balance with the financial balance?
Thank you, Jim, for this pertinent question. Indeed, we pay attention to the situation of the most vulnerable groups of population in the situation of crisis. Talking about retired people, families and households with many children, and other groups of population. In the framework of anti-crisis measures, we took a number of measures to support these groups of population. One of the biggest major decisions was to optimize and modernize the procedure for earmarking and calculating the amount of pensions. This will increase 50% pensions as compared to the current status next year, which is a big figure. It took us several years to take this decision, and it so happened that it coincided with a crisis. During crisis, it is difficult and very hard to take such major decisions on additional expenditures in the amount of 1.5% of GDP. This will increase our taxes because of the social allocations. The allocations and expenditures will increase only next year, but in the interest of businesses to restrict the taxable basis in 2010, we will increase the taxation starting 2011. It is adequate to increase 1% starting 2011 the amount of taxes from the payroll amounts. This will be a major measure because the employers are unwilling to pay, of course, which is normal, but we will take this measure due to the current situation of pensioners. The reforms also provide for a number of measures on pension insurance, new principles of allocations, accumulation of rights of pensioners, including compulsory pay-as-you-go part of the pension, which will be constituted and accrued on the deposits of the pensioners. This is a new measure. We decided not to postpone this program, and starting 2010 the pensioners will get an upgrade and increase of pensions. But there will be some pensioners who will not get enough due to the small amounts of accumulated rights in the previous periods due to the absence of seniority record or due to low income categories or sectors they worked. For those pensioners, we will ensure the minimum living standard, thus removing them from the category of the line below poverty. This is an ambitious program which will, however, implement since it has been prepared for several years now. Another measure is the support of the families with many children. In 2007 we started the program to support families where, with a second or third child and more. We allocated the so-called capital for maternity. This capital can be accumulated, and this is the right provided to every family to buy a house, to spend it on education, or to use it as a part of pension capital, such as a contribution from maternity fund. This will use part of our reserves for long-term incentives to families with 2 or more children. We this year we decided that we will spend somewhat less $500 for the second child starting this year. They will get cash allocation, which is kind of a modernization of initial idea as a measure to support families, especially now due to the reduction of the living standard. We will look and see whether we will be able to extend it. I'm talking about the cash allocations. Based on the analysis how this will affect the status of those families. Now we are working on targeted assistance to families. This was a major topic on our agenda. On top of our agenda, when we had a lot of resources, the measures were not specific, targeted or earmarked to specific groups. Now we are shifting from more expensive program to more targeted and more specific oriented allocations to those in need. Our objective is to overcome poverty in the next 12 or 18 months. Thank you.